Can you hear me? My name is Barry O'Halloran. I'm a chartered surveyor, and I'm going to have a talk with you today about commercial lease agreements, specifically from a tenant's perspective. A lot of the work we do as chartered surveyors at Logical is to assist various clients either acquire or dispose of property by sale or by lease. And the reason for our chat today is really for the benefit of occupiers who may be less educated in the process than a professional landlord in commercial space would typically be. So the nature of the leases I'm going to talk about today would be specifically office, retail or industrial. We deal mostly with office leasing. However, broadly speaking, the lease agreements are of a similar nature. The types of leases that we would see typically will be a lease agreement between a willing landlord and a willing tenant, a sublet between an existing tenant for some space and a new tenant, the assignment of an existing lease to a new tenant, where the new tenant will step into the shoes effectively of the outgoing occupier, and then there are various other license agreements, caretakers agreements for short-term space or parking or various other smaller kinds of agreements. The principal components of the lease agreement that I'm going to chat about today are ones that maybe the occupier who's about to take on a new lease of space might not fully understand. Typically there will be a tenant's representative, a chartered surveyor on the tenant side, and obviously a legal advisor. Sometimes the various nuances around break options and repairing obligations can be tricky to understand as a tenant. So the term, how long are we taking the space for? Are we sure we need it for, are we looking for a break at year 3? Do we actually really need that? Is it where are we going to be in 5 years? What's our cost, our rent, our occupational cost? Is their use correct? Is it correct for the office we're going to open? Is it educational use? Our break options are an interesting one. We frequently get asked to seek break options early in the term because people have a fear of being tied into a lease agreement for a long time. So we would often be asked, can we get a break at year 2? And in all my years, I've rarely seen anybody actually try to exercise a break that early unless they have a specific short-term requirement for the space and need to exit early. So I would typically encourage people to look at break options that are more relevant to review periods, maybe after your rent review, so you have some leverage during that review. And to ensure that the break option suits the tenant and not the landlord. Quite often a tenant mightn't understand that the break option that's in the lease is a landlord or tenant break option. Covenant and guarantees, obviously that's very important for a lot of our clients that are coming in from the States or from Europe. While their parent company might be very strong, their Dublin entity might be very new, and so they may need a parent guarantee or some other form of guarantee to ensure they can get the space. We would frequently look at the occupational cost, apart from the obvious rent, rate, service charge, insurance, the fit-out cost specific to a given space, the energy occupational cost, and other bits like parking and that. So we would frequently have, say, 3 shortlisted properties for a given tenant, and we'll do a model of what kind of air conditioning is in the space, what kind of heating is in the space, cooling, what's their occupational cost on top of the rent, rates, service charge, and how does that work? Landlords fit out and tenants fit out. What's our landlord going to do for us? Is it advanced shell and core, raised access floors, suspended ceilings, lighting? Is there air conditioning included? Or do we have to do it as part of our tenant's fit out? This can have a huge impact. We looked at a space recently for an occupier, and the AC, air conditioning, formed part of the tenant's fit out, and the cost was over €500,000. So it has an impact on the way in. It's also important at rent review that your tenant's fit out is expressly approved and disregarded in terms of value. So in other words, if your rent review is after 5 years, we'll need to look at the space as you got it, not as you have fitted it out. So in other words, if the space as you received it 5 years ago is reviewed at 50,000 euros, for example, well then it's important that it's not valued at 60,000 because of the improvements that you've made. But that will need to be expressly outlined in your rent review provision in the lease. Full repairing and insuring versus internal repairing and insuring. So obviously a full repairing and insuring lease is, as the name suggests, it's everything. So in a Georgian property, for example, if you're taking the entire building, you're responsible for the roof, the windows, the pointing on the outside, drainage, anything connected with the building. Whereas on our internal repairing and insuring, we're only responsible for obviously the internal. Typically it would be the interfaces of the structural walls, the soffit of the concrete slab above in a new office building, but it will include what's above the ceiling, the raised access floor, and what's below the raised access floor. On some internal repairing leases, you will find things like the windows are included or excluded. So as an occupier, you would typically try to exclude the windows on a Georgian, as they could be, 7,000 or 8,000 euros per window to put right at the end of the term. And you may not be aware that in an internal lease, repairing and insuring, that you've got to maintain those also. So what are our obligations, apart from paying the rent rate, service charge, insurance, etc., to repair and maintain and to yield up? So the yield up provision, if there is a yield up clause, some leases, older leases don't have a yield up clause, you will be specifically asked to repair and maintain in some shape or form. A lot of our clients coming from Europe, where we worked for 4 or 5 years in the Czech Republic and in Belgium, wouldn't be used to this yield up and dilapidations query, because typically you'd broom sweep, decorate and exit. So it's important that on entering a lease agreement that you understand fully what you're going to be asked to do at the end of the term. And there is a lot of nuances and wording differences, and my previous speaker referred to specific wording in his legal document. I'm not a lawyer, but such as put and keep in a tenantable and maintained order, as opposed to keep. And to repair or to repair and renew, all of these different terms have different meanings. So at the end of the term, it can mean a big difference in your settlement if you have to make a cash settlement. Yielding up as well, quite often we see a tenant will just allow the lease term to come to its end and will think, oh, I'm not going to say anything to the landlord and hand him back the keys. At that point, the only remedy, if there is a dilapidations issue, is a cash settlement. So we would be typically advising our clients, if they're on the tenant side, to be aware, 6 months in advance, make contact with the landlord, tell them, look, we're going to replace the carpets, we're going to redecorate, we're going to pull out our partitions, whatever it is you intend to do, and get approval for that from the landlord. I've put down a note here in schedule condition. Continually we still see legal advice saying on new properties, for example, that we don't need schedules of condition. Quite often one of the big issues, for example, on a building that maybe have been occupied for 5 years, on an IRI lease, including the floors, is, for example, the floor may have been installed incorrectly. It may have been brand new, but it was installed incorrectly, and it would appear on the schedule of dilapidations at a cost of 120 euros a metre to replace it. And to replace the floor, you have to remove your fit out, etc., etc. So it's fundamental that a schedule of condition is obtained and carried out either by the tenant or by the tenant and the landlord directly, if you are the tenant. I'm talking from a tenant's perspective here. And that the schedule of condition is photographic, but also describes in words clearly what the condition is. For example, if it's a brand new raised access floor and it's incorrectly fitted, that needs to be noted on the way in, and that will mitigate your loss at the other side, at your risk at the other end. It's also important that the schedule of condition is referred to in the lease as schedule of condition prepared by Mr. X, dated Y, and appended to Schedule 3 or whatever at the back of the lease agreement, and that it's signed by the landlord and the tenant. Rent review. Previously we'd upward only rent reviews in most leases. and that changed in February 2010. So now we've up and downward leases, but it's important if you're taking an assignment of a lease that maybe pre-2010, it's likely that you'll have upward-only rent review provision in that lease. We've spoken about tenant improvements. Again, it's important that when you at rent review, that when you take the space on, that your fit out is approved, but that's also disregarded at rent review. And if that's not expressly mentioned in the rent review clause, well then it can impact on your rent review. I put break option in here around rent review because, again, I said it earlier, rather than trying to get break options in very early, it's important that we maybe put I always try, if I'm actually with a tenant, to get my break option in year 6 if the rent review is in year 5, which means if our landlord comes along and says, okay, our rent is going up 30%, well, if we intend to stay on board in the space, we can say, look, we'll tear up our break option if you can agree that we'll increase it by 15%, for example. And a landlord will typically, or could typically say, well, look, I don't want to take the space back, I don't want to redecorate it, clean it out, put up a board. He typically would be likely to say, we'll find a middle ground. So I think break option after the review, if I'm advising a tenant, is can be very beneficial in terms of leverage. So risk, I suppose the point is that the landlord will be more clued into what he's doing here typically than the tenant. So it's to ensure that you're protected in terms of your term, that you have enough time in the space. So rather than everybody being delighted with a 4-year, 9-month lease, I think that it's great to get a 4-year, 9 lease, you have flexibility. Well, the landlord also has flexibility. So if you're happy with a 4-year, 9-year lease, 4-year, 9-month lease, I would be saying to an occupier, well, why not let's take a 10-year term with a break at year 6. It's broadly similar term. And the landlord will typically take a view that if it's a 10-year term, you might do better on the way in. You might get a better landlord contribution to your fit out. You might get a longer rent-free period, and also you might get we could put a second rent-free period into the second part of the term. Assignments, again, needs to be watched very closely. If you're stepping into the shoes of another occupier, you'll be liable, for example, if they've been in occupation for 20 years and there's 5 years to run on the term, you will be liable for their dilapidations and any other tenant obligations to that up to your occupation. So that needs to be either mopped up in some sort of term of agreement or settlement on the way in, because you can be clobbered at the term end for large repairs and dilapidations. Rent review we've spoken about. Dilapidations is kind of a hot topic, and you hear a lot about schedules of dilapidations, and we do a lot frequently for landlords and serve them on tenants. But there's no obligation on a landlord to do a schedule of dilapidations. So quite often the landlord will remain silent till the end of the term, wait for you to hand the keys back, and then the only remedy is a cash settlement. So, and also when agreements are made, we had a case recently where a large global financial company, and at the end of the term, they made an agreement with their landlord to say, our dilapidations and repairs bill, they agreed at €500,000. So they drew a line, paid that $500,000, and they said they'd stay on for an additional 2-year term on the basis that when they exit, they decorate, broom sweep, and hand back the keys. During that 2-year period, the landlord went into receivership, and we were acting for the receiver. And when we examined that agreement, it was very poorly executed with very poor documentation, and the schedule was 10 years out of date. And to cut a very long story short, an additional €350,000 was paid at the end of the 2-year term. So it's important that any of these kind of agreements you make with your landlord, whether they're verbal or on good faith, if the landlord or the tenant, if either party changes during that following period, well, then you can come unstuck. So that's really my view on what a tenant needs to be aware of on their way into a commercial lease agreement. And if anybody's any questions, I'll be delighted to answer them.